Now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent rich man of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz.
And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain, behind someone in whose sight I might find favor."
She said to her, "Go, my daughter."
So she went. She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. As it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech.
Just then, Boaz came from Bethlehem. He said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." They answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his servants who was in charge of the reapers, "To whom does this young woman belong?"
The servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the Moabite, who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers." So she came, and she has been on her feet from early morning until now, without resting even for a moment.
Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped, and follow behind them. I have ordered the young men not to bother you. If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn."
Then she fell prostrate with her face to the ground and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight, that you should take notice of me when I am a foreigner?"
But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to refuge."
Then she said, "May I continue to find favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, even though I am not one of your servants."
At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some of this bread and dip your morsel in the sour wine."
So she sat beside the reapers, and he heaped up for her some parched grain. She ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over.
When she got up to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, "Let her glean even among the standing sheaves, and do not reproach her. You must also pull out some handfuls for her from the bundles, and leave them for her to glean. And do not rebuke her."
So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. She picked it up and came into the town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gleaned. Then she took out and gave her what was left over after she herself had been satisfied.
Her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you."
So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and she said, "The name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz."
Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "Blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "This man is a relative of ours, one of our nearest kin."
Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay close by my servants until they have finished all my harvest.'"
Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is better, my daughter, that you go out with his young women. Otherwise you might be bothered in another field."
So she stayed close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest. And she lived with her mother. I want to also read you this passage from the They came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent. For on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. He sat down and called the 12 and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last and servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Let us pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks for the beauty of this day. We give you thanks for the beauty of one another, for this amazing congregation. We pray, O Lord, that we might sense your Spirit in our midst, that we might listen for your voice speaking particularly to us. Mold us and shape us to be your family of faith. And let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. For you are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Max Lucado has written a lot of books for children and books for adults. And I love his story about Chippy the parakeet. He imagines it like this, a simple news report. The news report goes like this: Chippy the parakeet never saw it coming. 1 second he was peacefully perched in his cage. The next he was sucked in, washed up, and blown over. The problems began when Chippy's owner decided to clean Chippy's cage with a vacuum cleaner. She removed the attachment from the end of the hose and stuck it in the cage. The phone rang and she turned to pick it up. She barely said hello when swamp. Chippy got sucked in. The bird owner gasped, put down the phone, turned off the vacuum, and opened the bag. There was Chippy, still alive but stunned. Since the bird was covered with dust, she grabbed him and raced to the bathroom, turned on the faucet, and held Chippy under the running water. Then, realizing that Chippy was soaked and shivering, she did what any compassionate bird owner would do. She reached for the hairdryer and blasted the pet with hot water. Poor Chippy never knew what hit him. A few days after the trauma, the reporter who initially written about the event contacted Chippy's owner to see how the bird was recovering. Well, she replied, Chippy doesn't sing much anymore. He just sits there and stares. And the reporter ends, it's hard not to see why. Sucked in, washed up, and blown over. That's enough to steal a song from the stoutest of hearts. Max follows up that pretend article with this. He says, can you ever relate to Chippy? One moment you're seated in familiar territory with a song on your lips, and then the pink slip comes, or the rejection letter arrives, or the doctor calls with a bad report, or the divorce papers are delivered, or the check bounces, a policeman knocks on your door. You're sucked into a black cavern of doubts, doused with the cold water of reality, and stung with the hot air of empty promises. The life that had been so calm is now storming your hail, stormed by demands, assailed by doubts, plummeted by questions, and somewhere in the trauma, you lose your joy. Somewhere in the storm, you lose your song. My hunch is that a lot of us know what it is to be like little Chippy. This old life is hard sometimes, and what we discovered is that being a Christian doesn't shield us from the storms that come our way. In fact, being a Christian often plunges you into the midst of the storms. Jesus on the road with his disciples was always trying to tell them that stormy times were going to come because of their faith. He was going to have to lay down his life on the cross, and they didn't understand. Sometimes being a Christian plunges you directly into the midst of those storms. At other times, life just happens. And life isn't fair. It's hard. Sometimes we feel like little Chippy, sucked in and washed up and blown over. So my question this morning is, what gives us strength in the midst of those kinds of days? What frees us up to be able to sing God's song of joy again? What is the hope to which we cling? And most importantly, how can we be a community of faith that lift each other up in the midst of those kinds of days? James writes, whenever you face trials of any kind, consider it nothing but joy. Now, I don't know about you, but that's hard to do. When you face trials, it is hard to consider it joy. I love the book of James. James is what you call a practical theologian in the tradition of the wisdom. He's got a lot of wisdom to share. And he has this wonderful sense that faith is something that's lived out in the ordinary days of our lives, and that you can find joy in the midst of the storms. If you live with God's wisdom and with its purity and its peacemaking how you speak to one another, how you love one another, how you help one another is what's most important. He has those verses about faith without works is dead, and he says it's important to treat each other without partiality, to lift each other up, and in our passage today, to pray with one another. In other words, to be with one another through the good times and through the hard times. We're called to draw near to God, and God will draw near to us. And part of drawing near to God, in James' understanding, is drawing near to each other. That's what I love so much about this congregation. I've seen you lift each other up in the hard times. Be there for those who are in the midst of the chippy days, when life is hard. And what a gift it is to be a community of healing, a community of faith. I love our Old Testament story, too, the story from Ruth. Now, weeks ago, I promised you a sermon series on the book of Ruth, but I got so excited about the lectionary text, I just forgot all about that. But I decided we better finish this up. So this week, the next time I preach, I'm going to preach on the book of Ruth. Preach a sermon several weeks ago about Ruth-styled caring. And as you remember, in the story of Ruth, there was a need for a lot of caring, because life had hit, and it had hit hard. You remember the story how it had been a time of famine in Bethlehem. The word Bethlehem means house of bread. Famine in the house of bread. That was very, very ominous. And so you see Naomi and her husband and sons venturing to a far-off land, and you see the sons into Moab. It's a foreign land, a land of former enemies. They were refugees in this country, and you see the sons growing up and getting married to Moabite women, and then tragedy hits. I don't know if it was a sickness or what, but the husband and the sons die. And Naomi decides it's time to go back. And the daughter-in-laws, she's worried about their safety, knows she can't provide for them, and she says, as they journey with her on the road, he says, no, you all need to go back home to your people, because I can't provide for you. You remember those beautiful words. Orpah does go back home, but Ruth says, entreat me not to leave or forsake you, because where you go, I'm going to go. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. And I think she knew that without her presence, Naomi probably wouldn't have survived. She wouldn't have made it through the hardest of times. And yet they do survive. And Naomi experiences her bitterness eventually turning back to joy. And in the place of emptiness, there is fullness. And next week we're going to see how a little baby is born who becomes one of the relatives of David, one of the grandpas of David, and eventually the great-great-great-great-great-great-grandpa of the Christ. As I read the story of Ruth, I've been struck in the story by how it proclaims loud and clear that we simply need each other. I've titled this sermon, Together We Hurt and Together We Heal. And you see, I think that the church has the distinct calling of helping one another through the hard times of life. Sometimes we're on the giving end, sometimes we're on the receiving end. But we have this wonderful healing function to be there for one another. I was a part of a clergy women's group in eastern Tennessee. And we would meet every year, and you know, it was in sort of the days during back about 27 years where clergy women weren't always accepted as pastors, and they had hard stories to tell, and they would meet every year. We would sit around in a circle of faith, and we would tell our story of the year, and sometimes one woman would be in tears, and then the next one would have stories of bright hope. But then the next year, the one who had been in tears might be in good places, and the one who had been on high places might be in the valley. And what I loved was year after year after year, they journeyed with each other, and they became a healing presence for one another. What I love about the story of Ruth is that God isn't up there in the clouds somewhere, but God is in the midst of the people, in the midst of the relationships. The story of Ruth says to me that we're called to be healing hands for one another. You might remember that there are two key words in the book of Ruth. There's the word hesed, which we talked a little bit about last time, which is loving kindness, steadfast love. And you have to say it with a little guttural hesed. We all try that. Hesed. But there's also this other word, goel, G-O-E-L, which stands for kinsman redeemer. And in the book of Ruth, you see this breathtaking web being formed. It's as they're all connected with one another. And there are many people in the book of Ruth who play the role of the goel, or the role of the redeemer. Ruth certainly plays that role with Naomi. Without Ruth's presence, Naomi might have stayed empty. She might not even have survived. And yet there are other redeemers. We're going to hear next time about Boaz. Ruth reaches out to Boaz, and he reaches out to her. And then Naomi gives her right to marry the nearest of kin, which she thought would be Boaz, to Ruth. She sends Ruth to Boaz. And then Ruth's relationship to Boaz becomes redemptive because she eventually births this child who will be the forerunner of David and eventually of Christ. God in this story is found in the human relationships that are shared. Where do you think of God being? Someone once said is that if we always thought of God as up, our eyes should have been on the top of our heads. Worship. Instead it's worship. And God made us with eyes to look at one another and discover God's presence in our midst. Now, our faith has two dimensions. It's got a vertical dimension, and it's got a horizontal dimension. And the vertical dimension is important. We look up to God. We look up to God's presence, but equally important is the horizontal dimension. Remember, Jesus said there's two great commandments: love God with all your heart, soul, and mind and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. In the book of Ruth, you see a lot of the horizontal dimension of faith taking place. God acts right here in the midst of the nitty-gritty of our lives. And so my hand reaches out to yours, and your hand reaches out to you, and I pray for you, and you're called to pray for me. And remember what they called Jesus? They called him Emmanuel, which means God with us. So we see Emmanuel, God with us, in each other as we flesh out the gospel together. Think of two scenes particularly in the book of Ruth that show this flip-flop from a vertical to a horizontal. The first comes when the widows are traveling back and they come to that place where they reach the crossroads point where Naomi will try to send the daughter-in-laws back home. And Naomi does something beautiful then. She utters this beautiful blessing upon them. A blessing that wishes that God will help their path be made whole again. In this case, she hopes that they'll find a new husband. So you have Naomi down here, hoping that God up there will bless the daughter-in-laws with a new song. But later, there's this dramatic switch to the horizontal. For in chapter 3, you see Naomi suddenly doing her best to make this all happen. She's the one who says, oh, you got to keep cleaning in Boaz's field. She's the one who suggests to Ruth the plan of going to ask Boaz at the threshing floor to marry her. And it's through Naomi's action that her wish, her blessing for Ruth actually comes to life. And the fascinating thing is that this same kind of flip-flop, this same kind of dynamic happens between the characters of Boaz and Ruth. Remember when Boaz first encounters Ruth out in the field, he takes her kind of under his wing. He asks her to eat lunch with him, and he's really amazed at how she is caring for her mother-in-law. And he finally says these words of blessing. He says, "May the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, give you all that you have deserved." So again, he is down here wishing that God up there will bless Ruth. Yet it's not long before the amazing switch takes place. Because in the very next chapter, Ruth on the threshing floor will encounter Boaz by proposing marriage, and she throws back his same words to him. She says, "You spread your wings over me." You see the flip-flop? God in this story isn't waiting up there to plot blessings down on us. Instead, God is discovered right here in the midst of the relationships that are shared. So sometimes you're going to be on the receiving end. And sometimes you're going to be on the giving end. Together we hurt. Together we heal. Together we know what it means to be the church. The more I go on in this lifetime, the more I discover that you can't heal alone. And instead, my healing goes hand in hand with yours. We need each other. And if I sit here like an island unto myself, silently weathering my hurts, and you sit there weathering your hurts, chances are we'll remain broken and hurting. But the beautiful gift of this family of faith is that we can share our hurts with one another. In short, we need each other. Think of two stories that come to mind. One was written by Marion Bond West in an article that she wrote called "The Loving Arms of God." She talks about the hurt she was feeling. It was one of the hardest times in her life. Her husband was 48. They had several young children. He was going through cancer, and the prognosis wasn't very good. She said in those days she would have dreams of herself down at the ocean. And it was like she had experienced with as a child when she'd been at the ocean, and a big wave had come over her and she got scared. It felt like it was dragging her away. Well, she said during this time when things were so bleak in their family health and wholeness wise, it was just, she would have this nightmare over and over, this wave tumbling over her, and she couldn't stand. Well, it was a few days later, though, that healing began to break in. She found herself in a treatment room. She spent a lot of time in that treatment room. And she was very blue. And she felt God nudging her to go over and to speak to a person who was also in the waiting room. It was a woman she had noticed a lot, an older woman in a wheelchair. She went to the older lady and she said, "Hello, my name is Marion. What is yours?" And there was no answer. She wasn't in the mood for making small talk, so she simply said, "God loves you." Well, the woman's cold blue eyes flashed at her angrily, and she said, "I don't believe in God." Well, Marion felt something stirring inside her, and she said, "Well, that doesn't keep God from loving you." And she said, "What's your name?" And she said, "I'm Thelma." And then she said, "I'm dying, you know, I never believed in God or asked him for anything, and I won't start now. I'm a stubborn old woman." Well, Marion said to her, "I like you." And the woman said, "Why?" And Marion said, "Because you're honest, and I'm going to see you tomorrow." Well, Marion's husband came out of treatment, and they went home. Well, that night she kept thinking, praying about Thelma. She wanted to bring her something. Well, the woman didn't believe in God, so she had a praying hands. That didn't seem like it would work. And she had an extra Bible. That didn't seem like it would work. But then came these instructions from God. Just kind of popped in her imagination. It said, "Take Thelma that beautiful ivory handmade shawl that is in your closet. Take it to her. Say, 'This isn't a shawl.' Put it around her." She said, "Tell Thelma, this isn't a shawl. It may look like one, but this is the loving arms of God embracing you. Tell her it's from me. Wrap the shawl around her and then hug her a little longer than necessary." Well, the next day, Marion found Thelma in the waiting room, and she went over to her that she had something for her. Thelma snapped at her and said, "I don't want anything from you. I don't even know you." But Marion lifted out the beautiful shawl and wrapped it around her, and she gave her a hug, a little longer than necessary. And she told her that this was a gift from God. And though it looked like a shawl, it wasn't. Thelma began stroking it, and she said, well, what is it then? And she said, it's the loving arms of God, holding you and loving you. Well, Thelma was touched, and her face softened, and you could see the tears. She said, but I've been stubborn for so long. And she said, it doesn't matter, he sent you this shawl. Well, Mary didn't see Thelma for a while. Her husband wasn't doing well. She felt the need to hear from Thelma. She heard, though, Thelma ended up in the hospital. She heard that Thelma, who had been far before from being a model patient, had appeared one day on the floor of the hospital with a shawl. And she kept insisting that it wasn't a shawl, that it was the loving arms of God. And she began to tell others about God's love. She was never without the shawl. Miriam was an author. She sent her a book she had written, and inside the cover she wrote, "Stubborn old women are God's specialty." And slowly the story goes that Thelma changed. And she began smiling and greeting each other, and her eyes had a sparkle. Her condition outside was worsening, but inside she was knowing inner healing. What I love most about this story is at the same time that Thelma was going through all of this, Marion was experiencing healing of her own. She still had the dreams about the ocean and the waves. But the dreams changed because in the midst of that dream, she was now standing, tall as a rock, and the waves were coming. But she was able to find strength. As she reached out with healing to another, she found healing for herself. The important thing about healing is that we have to open ourselves to receiving as well as to giving. And the important thing is that sometimes we heal as we give to one another. Ruth walked with Naomi, and together they healed. Yet she also reached out to Boaz, and she received healing from him. Now the danger is you can get a Messiah complex. You can think it's your job to heal and fix everything. My son Joel always tells me, "Mama, you can't fix me. Just love me and listen to me." Sometimes we think we can love others into wholeness when they may need professional help. I remember one time I tried to fix something I just couldn't fix. I ended up very hurt. That summer I decided, well, I can't just sit here in the hurt. I think I'll go be a camp counselor. Nothing like children to help you in the healing phases of your life. Healing came that summer in seminary as I went and worked with these kids. A lot of them were from the inner city. They were very challenging. Sometimes we had very, very hard weeks. They were from the inner city, and we were out in the woods, and things like, they didn't know what all those peepee toads were about. You know, in the evening, the night sounds were so different, and they could get into squabbles, and they were from a different culture, and sometimes I felt like I was a failure. And if you wanted them to go off the high adventure course in the zip line, you had to do it yourself first to model that, and I was tired. It was in the middle of the week, and we had tried to move from our campground cabin out into a tent, and this was way out of their comfort zone. And in those days, we had sleeping bags spread over. It was a little hint of cold in the air. And in the middle of the day, all the blankets had gotten pulled off of me. So there I was in the cold, and they thought I was asleep. And one of them woke up, and she said, "Look at that counselor woman. She ain't got no covers." And then she gently took those covers and wrapped them around. Remind me of God's grace. God's grace wants to wrap you up in His love this morning. I don't know where you are this morning. Some of us are on the need for healing, and some of us are on the need for giving. But I do know that together we hurt, and together